Well, hi, thank you all for being here for this presentation by Dr. Matthew Buckman, who was, what's your title exactly? You're a professor of music and director of the jazz program, right?
That's right, you got it. Very
Wonderful.
Yep.
He's presenting here as part of the Critical Thinking event series, which is designed to celebrate the inauguration of the Critical Thinking General Education Program here at UWSP, a distinguishing feature. And I had the honor of working with Professor Buckman and other colleagues. I think I see Professor Ross down there, which has been a wonderful opportunity for me to see how critical thinking is infused across the curriculum and the absolutely practical applications of critical thinking, not just to other disciplines, but to business. And so I'm delighted to present Matthew Buckman talking about, does making sense make sense?
All right, thank you, Dawn. So I'm curious, if I'm standing this far away from you, is it okay if I remove my mask? Is that all right?
Yeah.
That'll be better for the camera, I think, too. And then I'll be able to be heard a little bit better. So we're only a couple weeks away from everybody losing them. Or losing them if you're comfortable doing so. So I want to thank you all for being here. I want to start with an apology and then a couple of disclaimers. The apology is that I think some of you maybe showed up back in December for this presentation when we canceled it. So if you were among those people who showed up only to find the hall was dark and no one was here, I'm sorry about that. Glad that we were able to reschedule this. The disclaimer is that I'm not going to solve any issues tonight. I'm basically going to try to present arguments for and against streaming, and it's kind of even ridiculous to talk about arguments against streaming because streaming is here to stay. You know, I'm pretty sure of it. In fact, when I ask my music students, you know, how many of them have, you know, what has their latest CD purchase been, they give me a blank stare. No one purchases CDs anymore, or very, very few of us do. I do. But I think that we can all acknowledge that streaming is so convenient and it is such a great way of listening to our favorite artists. But it's not without some controversy. As some of you may be aware, artists like to complain about how little they're being paid for the music that's being consumed by us, their adoring fans. I want to tell you that the music that you were listening to before I started was an album called Sangam by Trygve Saim. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. He's a Norwegian saxophonist composer, and it's one of my favorite recordings that I'm listening to lately. And I'm listening to it on Apple Music, which is what I subscribe to. I also own the CD. So in a sense, I'm paying Trygve several times for the use of his music. But let's get started with the presentation. I will tell you that I'm probably not going to go straight to 7:30 because there is a wind symphony concert happening starting at 7:30. So I think I'd like to leave time for people to transition to go to that if they're going to do so. And then I'll also leave some time at the end for questions. All right. So, how many of you subscribe to online service provider? Show your hands. Yeah, that's what I figured. Almost all of you. So I'm piggybacking my presentation tonight on something that I did a few years ago for the LIFE program, which is a program that meets regularly with folks who want to continue learning, many of them retirement age. And so I gave a talk to them about what is streaming anyway. And so some of the data points that I shared with them, I'm going to share with you, even though they're a few years old. So 229.5 million subscribers for streaming services in 2018. And Spotify probably not surprisingly, maintains the global market share. Again, these numbers are old. I'm sure that those numbers have grown significantly. Apple Music accounts for the next biggest slice of the pie. Amazon Prime Music accounts for the next biggest slice of the pie, or did back in 2018. And I don't know how well you can see that, but it's basically a graphic that kind of shows you what all of those subscribers have going on in terms of their market share. There are some names on that list that I know about, but I'm not very familiar with. Deezer, Tencent Music. Pandora, of course, is a streaming service that isn't what we call on-demand. You log on, you start listening, and then it populates the listening list for you. It's a little bit different model. So I'll go through this kind of quickly because I'm sure most of us know basically what this is, what we're talking about. So streaming music is distributing music, the storage and delivery, and then the decoding of it. And what I mean by that is it comes in through the internet, gets to your computer, and then the device known as your computer or your phone translates the digital information into audio information. And as I mentioned, there are some different models. A lot of them I seem to be falling by the wayside a little bit. Pandora, which I just mentioned, and then there are some other services that were experimented with, like Amazon and Apple's what I'll call a locker service, where you essentially upload music from your own library onto the cloud, and then you have access to that music wherever you are. It's synchronized. You still own the music, and you probably had a physical copy of that music, and you've decided to upload it to their service, locker service. Of course, the most popular is the on-demand model, where you just type in whatever you want to listen to, and off you go. So how did we get to on-demand streaming music that you could listen to in the middle of Yellowstone National Park? That is isn't that pretty remarkable? Yeah, you have your phone, you can listen to anything. 30 million choices. So I'll go through this rather quickly. Thomas Edison invented the phonograph cylinder. And he sold a lot of units of that thing. And that was the dominant media for about 20 years until this guy by the name of Alexander Graham Bell invented the gramophone. And as the popularity of that particular medium grew, they began manufacturing these shellac discs, 78s, which had music on both sides. And that was the dominant media until the 1950s. So that's a pretty long run for that particular media. My sister, who is 12 years younger than me, and who did not grow up in the CD era, maybe I shouldn't call it an era, but during the time that the CD had dominance, had no idea because, she had not experienced LPs or 78s. She only had experienced CDs. When I took a record and turned it over and it played the other side, her jaw dropped. Oh my God, you can play the other side of that thing? That's amazing. Yeah. Imagine that. Other inventions came along. One was magnetic tape, which was a little bit of a benefit of World War II and some of the technology that went into that. And then pretty soon we had long playing records made out of vinyl, and again, that was in the 1950s. And so all of a sudden you could fit a lot more music on one disc, up to, 50 minutes, maybe an hour, probably not an hour, but It was a lot of music, a lot more than a 3-minute recording that you could fit on a 78. Sometimes people aren't aware that popular music, the recordings that we hear on commercial popular music, generally speaking, are 3 minutes long. Your pop tune averages between 3 and 4 minutes long. And some people don't realize that that was part of the reason that exists is because the 78s could only fit that much music. There's kind of a little bit of a holdover, and then I think people kind of got accustomed to only being able to pay attention to a recording for about that long. And so that's kind of stuck with us. And by the way, if the music was louder, the amount of music that they could fit on that 78 shrank, because the grooves on the record would have to be wider in order to reproduce that loud volume of that sound wave. Kind of interesting. Okay, so we're up to the LPs, the 33 1/3 rotation per minute. We had a couple of other technologies, the 8-track tape, the cassette. People still make cassettes. I find that very interesting. And then we get to the 1980s and we have a digital revolution, which of course accompanied the entire microprocessing revolution, which happened in the 70s and 80s. And so we figured out ways of turning analog into digital. And so just a little bit of a primer on how that happens. That red wave there is the sound wave. And the blue dots are data points measuring where that wave is in time. Okay? So kind of hold that picture in mind as you look at these next facts here. I'm sure probably some of you know that this binary digit, the thing that makes all of our computing happen, is called a bit. And the number of bits, those little blue points, in each sample gives us bit depth. CD quality is 16 bits per sample. 16 blue dots per sample. And the sample rate, the number of times we're taking a picture of that sound wave, is measured in hertz. Okay, number of pictures per second. And a lot of the standard frequency, this hertz-derived unit of frequency, is 44.1 kilohertz. 44,100 times per second. That's how many times it's taking a picture of the sound wave. At 16 data points per picture. Are you with me? You all understanding what I'm saying? That is a lot of data. And so in order to get all of that digital information, they had to come up with a storage device that could handle all that. And they came up with a CD that could handle all of that information, digital information. And so for a time, from the 1980s until well into the 1999s, maybe you could argue even into the 2000s, CDs were the dominant media that people used to purchase and play back music. Then, digital music moved from selling hard copies to delivering that online. Why didn't that happen right away? Because it's a lot of data. And in the 1990s, we were still dealing with dial-up modems. We didn't have high-speed internet, so we couldn't handle all that data. I remember early on, with some of the first companies that got into streaming music, some of them not legally, you would spend all kinds of time just downloading music or getting it to play, and the playback was terrible. It would stall, you'd get spinning wheels. It was really not efficient. Okay, so they have all this data. Some of the ways in which they decided to, or they tried to overcome the clogged pipes syndrome by trying to get all this data through the internet lines was to compress the data. And I'm going to get a little bit geeky here, but there are different technologies that compress music in different ways. Lossy versus lossless. A lot of the music that we listen to with MP3s and WAV files is what's considered lossy. And lossless, which is the higher quality audio, is also available, but through different service providers. Really high resolution. And so this was great. We all benefited from music accessibility, right? We could listen to music, all kinds of music, in the comfort of our own home. We didn't have to run out to the record store and pick up the latest CD. Unfortunately, that meant that a lot of people decided to start sharing music, and no one was paying for it. And that caused a lot of pain to the recording industry, because if one person buys a CD and then uploads it and then shares it with all of their friends, the recording industry has sold exactly one copy of that unit, and hundreds of people are enjoying it. And so they went into a tailspin for a number of years, and there was lots of hand-wringing about how are we going to solve this problem. There's got to be a way. Napster was one of the companies that got into some big legal hot water because they were kind of one of the companies that were involved with piracy. So streaming services come to the rescue. And what they argued was that now that everybody has gotten used to the idea of instant access to music, and just as a sidebar here, people also got used to not paying for music, or paying very little for it, which is, I think, unfortunately, here to stay. I don't really see that going away. It's unfortunate because that meant that the revenue stream for the recording industry and the artists has shrunk. I think probably for forever. There's still a lot of big numbers for some of the bigger labels and popular acts, but I think it's hard to argue that because of the devaluation of music, which is sort of the argument that's hovering in the background behind this whole discussion tonight, which is that music, some people have argued that music has lost its specialness, that it's been exploited, and because of its low value or its free commodity status, it has kind of lost that specialness. So it points to sort of the changing nature of the musical commodity. So back to the streaming services here. What they argued was, we're going to take this consumer behavior and we're going to try to figure out a way to monetize it. And so the first wave was that these companies tried to promote just downloading for a fairly nominal fee. I think iTunes was like a 99-cent download for a while, and that's how I purchased music. I'd be curious, how many of you have downloaded files from iTunes and then have it stored on a device, phone, computer? That seems to be something that was popular for a time, and then when streaming actually took over, a lot of people just didn't do that anymore because it was easier just to stream it. The difference here, of course, is that when you download a file, you own the music. When you stream it, you're renting it. You never own it. And I like to point out to my students that I still promote purchasing CDs for 3 reasons. Number 1, it puts more money in the pocket of the artist. Number 2, I get to see all of the information on that CD jacket that I can't see online. There's all kinds of information contained on there about recording date, who all the musicians were. That's really hard to find if you're looking on Apple Music. I feel like that's gotten better, but it's still not as much information as you're going to get out of a CD booklet, unless you get one of those digital versions of the CD booklet. I know that those are available, but it doesn't seem to be uniformly the case. And then the third reason, and probably the one that scares me the most, is that there is no legal obligation for Spotify or Apple or any of these services to permanently have those files available to us. Stop and think about that for a second. Have you ever watched a movie on Netflix and then a month later you want to go back and see it and it's not there? Same thing. Same thing. It's possible that they get to a point or something changes, who knows what is in the future, and then they decide to just start taking music down. Or the artist or the label decides to pull their entire catalog from a streaming service, which has happened for various reasons. And so those 3 arguments I like to hold out as a reason to continue to buy CD, because once I have that CD in my possession, I can always play it. So in the streaming model, the way that they earn money, and primarily my comments are gonna focus on Spotify for the rest of our time. The way that they make money is either through ad-based revenue, if you're on Spotify for free, or if you decide to pay for the monthly subscription. Do any of you subscribe to Spotify? What is the monthly subscription fee?
I think $5 something.
$5 a month? I think I pay $15 for the family plan for Apple Music. So I wasn't sure if it was similar.
Yeah, I do family, it's like 16 and you can have like 5 on it.
Okay, so it's pretty competitively priced with Apple. I would expect that to be the case. So that subscription part of the pie is Spotify's biggest source of revenue. That's what they're hoping for. Spotify is hoping to move as many people from the free ad-based over to the subscription. And so after Spotify began generating the kind of revenue that they generate, the recording industry started to see growth again. And that made them very happy because the amount of money that was being paid back to the labels, the recording labels, went from 0 when people were pirating money and not buying any physical product. I'm sure it wasn't 0, but it had declined, to finally they started seeing some real revenue stream again from the, no pun intended, from the streaming services. Okay, so I've already kind of given this part away. You know, what exactly is the argument? Well, of course it's money, right? And it really started, apparently, it gained media attention in 2009 when Lady Gaga recorded this song, Poker Face, and it had like 1 million streams, and it sold 9.5 million copies that year, and her check for the streaming part of it was $167. Now there's a little bit of controversy around what that number really was and what it entails, but as the saying goes, the mud stuck. And so those kinds of figures are what really artists like to hold up as why this model is unsustainable for artists. That is the argument on the artist side. This is unsustainable. Who can make a car payment and buy groceries and everything else for $167? Nobody. Just as a way to compare, we'll take a look at the economics of live performance versus recording. So the economics of live performance, it's pretty straightforward. People write music, people perform the music, there is a live performance of that music to which they sell tickets. The end. That's it. Now, of course, it's a little more complicated than that because there's venues and there's managers and there's agents and all of that, but it's pretty much you're selling tickets to that event and then it's over. The economics of recordings is way more complicated. Infinitely more complicated. And the reason is that there is a product that can be copied. And that product can be sold and sold again and sold millions upon millions of times. And so, that being the case, we have to get copyright law involved. Because if someone records a song, they write it, and then somebody else records it, or maybe it's the same person that both writes and records it, and then the record label sells it and resells it and resells it, it stands to reason that that person, the creator, would be entitled to at least a portion of those repeated sellings of that product. I don't think anybody would argue with that. And so that's copyright law. Copyright law is essentially divided into two different realms or categories. One is musical work, and the other is sound recording. There are two separate copyright categories. So if I write a song and it's fixed in some way, permanently fixed in some way, either I've written it down on a piece of paper, written the lyrics, written the chord symbols, that's permanently fixed, or even if I record it as an at-home kind of demo, it's permanently fixed on a recording media, right? So that is now a musical work. And if I take the steps of registering it with the United States government, it's then copyrighted. Actually, it's copyrighted anyway, but we won't go into that. The second kind of copyright is the actual sound recording that's made, that specific performance of that song, which is captured on a recording. And the copyright is owned usually by the record label and the artist who performed that. So they're two separate things. On the musical work side, so these are publishers and then songwriters, composers, there are various different ways that people can make money from their compositions. Now these are just the musical works themselves, not anything related to any sound recording. They've taken the song and then made their own recording of it. And so these licenses, copyright licenses, involve, or include rather, sync rights, anytime that you put music with a moving picture. Synchronization, you have to synchronize the the music with moving picture. Those are referred to as sync rights, so TV, film, anything like that that's on online. There's a license that you have to pay just to record a song that's written by somebody else. Okay, those are called mechanical rights. And so those get involved when you're talking about interactive streaming, like Spotify, digital downloads, selling CDs. And I don't have this on the presentation, and I can't remember what the statutory rate is, but it's something like 0.06 cents per minute of music, or there's some kind of convoluted equation that they have for how composers should get paid mechanical royalties for the music that they've created, and then somebody else has recorded. And it's it's an amount per minute of music. So that's how that works. And then there are performance rights. A lot of people don't realize that anytime music gets performed, either live on stage like this, in Mickelson Hall, in a coffee shop, in a department store, and you're hearing music around you, in the elevator, somebody is getting paid for that music to be performed, even if it's a recording that you're hearing. Okay? And that's a big, convoluted mechanism that I won't go into, but people are getting paid anytime you hear music, or they should be. You probably have questions about that, but we'll keep going. So live performance is included in that. On the sound recording side, okay, so these are tracks, maybe that's the best way to think about it, tracks. The license fees are paid to record labels, performers, and then musicians and background singers, which is kind of a new phenomenon. It didn't always used to be that way. If you went in and played bass on a Motown record in the 1970s, you went in, you did your job, you got paid $100 an hour probably, 3-hour minimum, so you probably walked out of the recording studio with $300 for playing your bass part on Michael Jackson's tune or whatever, and then that would be it. You'd get $300, and then that record would go on to make millions of dollars, and the bass player would have their $300. That would be it. That's, like I said, that's changed with some of recent legislation, but that seems to be the way it was. So sound recordings also involve sync rights. If you can think of a favorite recording that you have of an artist, and then you go to a movie and you see that exact recording being shown on screen, not only is the composer getting paid sync rights, but also the record company and the performer are being paid sync rights for that exact track to be married to the motion picture. Reproduction rights, performance rights, which again includes this interactive streaming that we're talking about tonight. Okay? That's licensing. You have to pay the copyright holder to use that thing. And those fees that, in this case, Spotify would be paying to the copyright holders, those fees go directly to the record labels. They don't go to the artists. Unless, of course, the artist has an independent label that they own, and it's all one big ball of wax. But usually when we're talking about labels and their roster of artists, they're the ones that are collecting those fees. Okay, so if we stop and think for a second, contracts being what they are, many of which have non-disclosure elements in them, so no one can ever find out how much actually labels owe their artists, except the people that sign those contracts. These fees get paid from Spotify to the labels, and then the labels take their cut and then give the artists whatever they contractually are obligated to give them. So when Lady Gaga said, I only got $167 for my, well, it had already been through a bunch of filters. including the record label. So there's a mechanism there that we have to acknowledge. It's kind of part of that financial transaction. When artists and record labels were just focused on selling physical units, right? LPs, 78s, CDs, that featured performer would receive what's called an artist advance from the record label. And if you were a really hot performer, you know, that advance might be $50,000, $100,000. It might be a lot of money. And the royalty payments that we all kind of know exist for artists, okay, where's my royalty payment? You know, those royalty figures or those rates usually are fixed at about 10% of all sales. Now, here's kind of an interesting thing that I was shocked to find out. Record labels have baked into their contracts that their expense for any given recording has to be covered 100% before the artist can receive any royalty payments. So if a record label spends, let's say, $50,000 for the artist advance, and then they have a marketing department, and then they have a distribution department, and then they have manufacturing costs, and they have all these costs involved with putting out a record. Let's say it tops $100,000. Now the artist royalty is 10%. And if a CD sells for, let's make the math easy, $10, it's probably more like $15 or $16. And they're getting 10%, their royalty rate is 10% of that, so let's say $1.60 for a $16. Every unit sold will bring the artist $1.60. And that $1.60 that the artist makes on the units that they sell gets paid back to the record company until $100,000 has been paid back. That's a lot of CDs that you have to sell to pay back what is essentially a $100,000 loan from the record company. Once the loan has been paid back, they've recouped all their expenses. And by the way, some record labels have cross-collateralization as part of their contracts, which means that if they put out 5 records from an artist, they have to have their expenses paid back on all 5 records before the artist can start making any royalty money. Crazy, isn't it? Okay, so then after all that money is paid back, now the artist starts making, let's say, $1.60 per unit sold. Now, the economics of streaming. This is the big argument. And Donna, I would have, had I had more time, I would have had the whole thing mapped out using
You're putting it broke down.
But I ran out of time. Here's the big argument. I'll call it a counter argument, because the argument that we started with was that artists were saying, we're not making enough money to make ends meet. It's not sustainable. The counter argument on behalf of Spotify and the streaming services is that their economy is not a unit-based economy. It's not a buy one CD, I give you $1.60 in return. You can't think of clicking and streaming a song as purchasing one unit, because first of all, you're not purchasing it. You're renting music. And so What they argue is that it's a consumption-based economy. The more people are paying subscriptions for easy access to consume their music, the bigger the pie gets. The bigger Spotify's pie gets. And what Spotify will say in its counter-argument is that we pay out 65 to 70% of all the money we bring in, we pay back to the rights holders. And they're accurate, that's not a lie. And this is where things get really confusing. You know, we hear on the one side, I only made $167 this month for 1 million, or whatever the number is, you know, very high volume of streams. And on the other side, the company's going, we're paying back 65 to 70% to the rights holders. Well, what does that really mean? They're paying back 65 to 70% to the labels. That's who's getting paid. And then they pay the musicians their share of that. And here's what's really interesting. If you have a lot of subscribers, they can literally stream endlessly. And so as the number of streams go up and the number of subscribers maybe stays kind of static or is starting to grow a little bit, obviously if the number of subscribers grow, the number of streams grow. But, you know, 100 subscribers could stream a lot of music. And so what happens is the yield per stream is very low. Does that make sense to everybody? So the bigger the pie, the more streams, the more money each stream will generate. So here's how Spotify figures out what they're going to pay people. They take their monthly revenue and they multiply the number of artists' Spotify streams divided by the total number of streams in that month. And then they multiply that by the 70% that is owed to the rights holders, and that equals the payment. So it's a consumption-based economy, not a unit-based economy. It's easy to see why people are making a half a cent per stream. Now that number has grown. It used to be like 0.3% or 0.3 of a penny. And then now we're like a half a penny, a little bit north of a half a penny. Might even get to a penny per stream, which seems kind of ludicrous, you know, on the face of it. But when you understand the mechanics of how everything is figured out and what Spotify's argument is, which is that we're not selling your music. We're just providing a service so people can have access to music. And so it's not going to yield the kind of money that you're used to getting when you sell a CD at $1.60 per unit. And then finally, one little side argument that Spotify would hold up is this. People talk about having a long tail. So something that people spend a lot of time and money in creating, like a track, musical track. Now it's on Spotify and it's going to be there for a long time. And so it will continue to, you know, make that money with no further out-of-pocket expense to the people who produced it, unlike a CD, where the record label has to pay something for every time they press a CD. There's manufacturing costs, there's distribution costs. So none of that is involved, presumably, in going through Spotify. Once they have the file, they have it. And then they can share it as many times as people click on it. And so over time, you're seeing that, what's called that long tail. So these days, this might be an interesting figure. I said that I wasn't going to have a whole lot of figures tonight, but if you put a track out and you manage to get 500,000 streams in any given month, you can expect a check from between $3,000 and $4,000 from Spotify, based on that rate. Just do the math. That's not too bad if you can get to 500,000 streams. One kind of addendum towards the end of this little spiel here, and that is, we keep talking about the record labels. There are only really 3 worldwide. There are independent labels until those independent labels get big enough and have a valuable enough catalog, and then one of the 3 major labels will come along and gobble them up. The 3 major labels are Universal Music Group, Sony Music Entertainment, and Warner Music Group. And if you can imagine these major labels with all of the artists that are in their catalog, what the check looks like, the labels get on a monthly basis, you can understand why the labels really like streaming. They like it. Their revenues have gone. So much so that major labels now own a certain percentage of Spotify. That's pulling the curtain aside, seeing what's really going on behind them. Which isn't actually, that's a little bit in keeping with what major labels have done all along, because major labels have owned distribution companies and the major labels own manufacturing. And so when they pay out money to these different parts of the business, they're essentially paying themselves. And that's kind of what's going on here. So. Yes?
I'm old. I've begged storage from old people when I was a kid. I've read a lot. But I've never known a time, perhaps with your experience and knowledge of the music industry, you can tell me, when were artists ever satisfied with the money they got for their performances?
Probably never.
Yeah. You were talking about the rights of copyright and so forth. Those are highly questionable because you have to sign over your rights to the record label. So they really don't mean anything to the individual or the artist.
That's correct.
So the rights in that sense are ridiculous. When you mentioned Napster, I remember that one of the people who was dragged into court, they said, who do I make the checks out to? What artists should I make the checks out to underline the point that there was no money going to the artists. My wife and I saw a really interesting show on Netflix a few years ago. This young man who was a musician, lives in Michigan, very Spartan life, lives in this kind of a beat-up home and whatnot. Never realized that the album he made hit the absolute stratosphere in South Africa. People in South Africa bought millions of copies of the CD. He had no idea. Never got a cent in royalty, not a penny. Didn't even know he was a thing. He went down there, they invited him to come down, and he was in shock as he saw sign after sign after sign going down the highway with his name on it. Everybody acted like he was a superstar. Everywhere he went, he was like being, several of our stars all rolled into one. It was just insane. They called it the soundtrack to apartheid. And he had absolutely no idea. And so things really haven't changed ever. Going to this live music performances and being able to sell tickets, sell pictures, autographs, T-shirts, that's always been where the money is.
That's correct.
It's just a thing that artists will only get money when they start their own labels like Motown, things like that. And I'm hoping that, I think it's a mischaracterization to say that music has been cheapened by technology because it's cheapened by the availability.
Hmm.
And really now, to be available is, you have to really want people to hear your music.
Mhm.
You have to be almost altruistic, because there are so many people out there now with the internet. Everybody with a microphone is now
Right.
a celebrity, an opinion leader,
Right.
all this kind of stuff. So I don't think there's any chance of that changing until we find some kind of a model where artists themselves are directly compensated. And the difficulty of doing that is that, again, either they have to take on the onus of all the paperwork,
Yep.
or they have to sign it over to somebody else, and boom, you're back into the old model again.
That's right. That's right. And those models do exist, where people are essentially taking on all of the responsibility of all of the production, the marketing, all of it, and then therefore reaping the benefit, more of the benefit from the sale of the product. Artist Share is one such model that doesn't, I'm sure that platform takes some kind of percentage, but there's an artist that I am a big fan of who has gone on quite a prolonged rant against YouTube, which is a topic that I won't even get into because that's a whole other can of worms. But Maria Schneider is her name. She's a composer and she leads her own jazz orchestra. She's from Minnesota. And she puts out all of her own music through Artist Share. And it's basically, for lack of a better word, kind of a subscription service. She sells at different rates these packages of experience-based kind of products surrounding the recording plus the recording itself. So for example, if you just want the recording, you send her $15 or $20 or whatever it is for the CD. But if you want to go behind the scenes and see footage of Maria Schneider on the tour bus with her band, coming up with the music and writing all night long and talking about this and that aspect and all these other kinds of backstory things that some fans really want to see and feel more connected to her and other artists that are doing this. You can do that at a higher dollar rate, and of course, for the really high dollar rates, you get your name mentioned right in the CD booklet. I would like to thank Matthew Bookman for his contribution, the silver, platinum level Artist Share, or whatever it is. And so that's how she's funded her recordings. And a few years ago, she won a Grammy and had completely sidestepped the major label mechanism through Artist Share, which was like a big victory. It truly was. Truly was. Yeah. Other questions? Okay, well, if there are no other questions, I know that some of you are here and would like to get credit for attending this tonight, and so you should see Jose in the back there for doing so. And I think I'm going to end it there so that I can make it over to my colleague's concert. Thank you all very much.